grab one of these little blue cards. If you do so, on the blue side, there is a place that you can, a link you can follow, and in that way you will be able to register digitally online. The other option is to flip it around. On the white part, you can complete your name and your email address, and we will register you from our end. Either way, being subscribed to our newsletter events is the best way to be in the know as of what's happening here at Regent. Before we start, if you have any electronic device that may produce any sound, if it rings, dings, or buzz, this is the time to put it on silent mode, as we would not like to be disrupted by any sound, electronic sound, during our lecture tonight. Lastly, those of you who join us online, please be aware that this event is being live streamed and recorded under the conditions spelled out by the public notice posted on the doors of this room and of Regent College. At this time, I would like to introduce Richard Thompson. He is our Director of Advancement here at Regent, and he will be our host tonight. Richard, over to you.
Thank you, Pablo. Good evening and welcome. What a delight to have you here with us tonight. And what a delight for us to welcome back Dr. Denis Alexander. His history with Regent in some ways goes all the way back to the 1960s and a relationship with our founding principal, Jim Houston at Oxford. And I understand that Denis is going to have the chance to visit with Jim while he is here this week. A number of us saw Jim yesterday at church at 102 years of age, and what a blessing that was. So Denis, glad you get to have that enjoyment of meeting with Jim. And more importantly for us tonight, we're glad that you are here to provide this lecture. So welcome back. Denis has taught here over the years, but it's been about a decade since Dr. Alexander was last here to teach, so welcome back. Good to have you here. Just a little explanation for how the evening will roll. And before I introduce our speaker to you, Dr. Alexander will lecture for about 45 to 50 minutes, taking us to close to about 8:30. At that time, we will have a Q&A session, you with the questions and he with the astute, brilliant answers. And of course, you might want to enter into some conversation. I'll help moderate that. For those of you who are online, and for those who are here who might not want to ask their question publicly at one of the microphones, at any time tonight, you can submit your question online at questions@regent-college.edu. So as the evening rolls along, feel free to do that. Pablo will read those questions later when we have the Q&A. And when we conclude around 9 o'clock, Dr. Alexander has graciously made himself available in our bookstore for a book signing, and so we invite you to join him there afterwards. Well, as I said, it is a real privilege to have Dr. Denis Alexander with us. He is the founding director emeritus of the Faraday Institute for Science and Religion at Cambridge, where he is Emeritus Fellow of St. Edmund's College. He is the past chair of the Molecular Immunology Program and head of the Laboratory of Lymphocyte Signaling and Development at the Babraham Institute at Cambridge. He also previously served at the Imperial Cancer Research Laboratories in London, which is now called Cancer Research UK, and spent 15 years developing university departments and laboratories overseas, latterly as Associate Professor of Biochemistry in the medical faculty of the American University of Beirut, where he helped to establish the National Unit of Human Genetics. From 1992 to 2013, he was the editor of the journal Science and Christian Belief. He also served as a member of the Executive Committee of the International Society for Science and Religion. It goes to a second page. It is a long and an impressive resume, but we are so pleased for what God has blessed you with in your gifts and abilities. His most relevant book for this topic tonight is called Is There Purpose in Biology?, published in 2018. And his most recent book, one that he co-edited in 2023 with Dr. Alistair McGrath, is entitled Coming to Faith Through Dawkins, a collection of 12 essays written by authors from 5 countries explaining how the ideas of the new atheist played an important role in their pathway from atheism or agnosticism to Christian faith. I believe both of those books are available in our bookstore, so you may wish to purchase that and have him sign it for you. We're privileged to have Dr. Alexander with us all week. He is teaching a course called Current Issues in Science and Theology that is part of Regent College's 2025 summer programs. And so would you now please join with me in offering a very warm welcome to Dr. Denis Alexander.
Is the sound okay? Now it's on. Oops, yeah, it's on. And it's really good to be back here in Vancouver in general, and also specifically to be back here at Regent College. I actually first came to Vancouver in June of 1964, a few years ago. I was traveling around North America. This was what we call the gap year in the UK. That's the gap between leaving secondary school, high school, and going to university. And so I spent a happy 6 months in the Welch's grape juice factory in St. Catharines, Ontario. Yeah, ever had Welch's grape juice? Anyway, I drank a lot. They said you could drink as much Welch's grape juice as you want. When I got there, and I thought, wow, that's really amazing. And then after the first week, it wasn't quite the same. But anyway, but I earned up enough money there to get a ticket going all around North America. All kinds of things happened. But I remember especially in Vancouver, the wonderful hospitality here. And in fact, I went, being brethren in background, I went to Granville Chapel on Sunday, and I was staying in the YMCA, I think, and the lady there, a kind lady called Mrs. Studd, said, "Oh, you can't stay there, come and stay with us for a few days." And so I experienced the wonderful hospitality of people from that particular church. And Jim Houston, actually, this was before I ever knew Jim, but I then went up as a student to Oxford, and a few months later, I met Jim Houston because I was brethren, and he was starting up a new brethren church in a suburb of Oxford, and I started going along to that church and had the wonderful privilege of joining him and his family and his wonderful wife at that time, who was a great cook, for Sunday lunch. Okay, so, and as a student, that is always such a great experience. In fact, I think it was ever since then that I really felt that having students around for Sunday lunch is such a good thing to do, and so that's what we still do in Cambridge. So many Sundays we have a bunch of students around, and leads to some great interactions and discussions. Well, I'm sort of reminiscing away because although we got the screen has gone okay, somehow the slides are not coming through to the screen down there, but never mind, we'll keep going and see how we go. So I better not reminisce any longer, but simply get down to our topic for this evening, evolution, a story of chance or a story of purpose. And I guess the first question is, well, why should we even be concerned about the answer to that question? And I think it's remarkable, and I'm going to have to check around here to make sure we're getting, we're getting okay through the slides that way, so that's all right. I think it's remarkable when you look back at the great scientific theories in the history of science, how often they've been used ideologically to support all kinds of different ideologies. And this has been one of the repetitive sort of features of the history of science. And of course, the theory of evolution in particular has been used in that particular way, especially since The Origin of Species, Charles Darwin, 1859. And I think the typical process is that a big theory like evolution gets respectable, it gets widely disseminated, it gets very popular, and as soon as that happens, then different groups move in to try and get the prestige of that theory to support their particular ideology. And so what happens is that you get a kind of process where this scientific theory X somehow gets invested with so much ideology that it ends up in the consciousness as scientific theory sort of Y, as ideological meaning Y. So people hear the word evolution, they go, that means this philosophy or that philosophy or whatever it is. And you can see that especially in the case of evolution. And here's just some examples. I won't work through all these in great detail, but if you look back at the history of evolutionary theory, we can see how it's been used in support of capitalism, in support of communism, racism, militarism, eugenics, feminism, theism, atheism. Have I missed any out? I don't know, but it's been used in support of pretty much every ism you can possibly imagine. And when you notice that some of these isms are mutually exclusive, then you start realizing, yeah, there's some real ideological transformation going on here. And it can be a very powerful force. Now, this evening, what I want to focus on is one particular ideological use of evolution, and that is the theory that it represents a theory of chance. And I hope, we'll see in a moment, that happens to be wrong. But I think what's particularly interesting about this particular ideological use, or abuse, if you like, of evolutionary theory in this case, is that it's been used both by secular people to support atheism. It's also been used by religious people, Christians in particular, to come to the opposite conclusion, that actually the theory itself is wrong. And so again, you can see how it's been used in all kinds of different ways. And I hope that you'll see how that works by the time you get through this evening. So let me just give you a few examples of some secular thinkers who've ridden on the back of evolution to claim that it's necessarily purposeless because it's a chance process. Here's the philosopher, the late Daniel Dennett. He asks whether the complexity of biological diversity, and I quote from him here, can really be the outcome of nothing but a cascade of algorithmic processes feeding on chance, and if so, who designed that cascade? And Dennett answers his own rhetorical question by saying, nobody, it is itself the product of a blind algorithmic process. Evolution is not a process that was designed to produce us, close quote. Here's another example. This is the evolutionary biologist William Provine. He was once professor for many years, professor actually at Cornell University, and I quote from Irvine. He said, "Let me summarize my views on what modern evolutionary biology tells us loud and clear, and these are basically Darwin's views." That's not true, actually, but we'll let that pass for the moment. These are basically Darwin's views. There are no gods, no purposes, and no goal-directed forces of any kind. Pretty clear statement. Maybe we'll just have a look at one more. This is another philosopher in this case, Alec Rosenberg from Duke University, who declares in his article, Darwin's nihilistic idea that Darwinian puts the capstone on denying that there is any meaning or purpose to the universe, its contents, and its cosmic history, close quote. We could give other examples, that's probably enough to get the point. Now, as I said, interestingly, you've also got some Christians who kind of take the opposite track. Well, they agree that evolution is a theory of chance, but they go in the opposite direction. And just give you one example here is the late Philip Johnson, who was the founder of the intelligent design movement. And here he's rejecting Darwinian evolution as being a theory of chance and therefore anti-Christian. I want to quote this fairly extensive quote from him to put it in context. He said, "The modern neo-Darwinian theory of evolution insists that evolution is an unplanned, undirected process. It combines elements of chance and necessity or natural law, a combination of random genetic changes or mutations which accumulate through natural selection. These are impersonal material forces reflecting no pre-existing intelligence and no guidance. As the outcome of this process, human beings are essentially unplanned acts of nature," close quote. In fact, Philip Johnson made this particular statement during a debate that he was having with William Provine at Stanford University. What I quoted from William Provine was part of that debate, as a matter of fact. So as you can see, both types of commentators here are using evolution to try and score philosophical or metaphysical points, and so they're taking the theory well beyond its status as a biological theory. And just before we take a closer look at this rather slippery little word chance, which has got several meanings, I just want to highlight one important theological point. And that is that even if evolution were a theory of chance, from a Christian biblical perspective, it really doesn't matter anyway, because the Bible makes quite clear that God can use chance events to fulfill his purposes. And some here may know Dr. John Hall from Victoria, just down the road here, or just down the water, I should say, maybe, who has made done some interesting writing in his hub in this particular topic. Well, here's a couple of key texts, or many texts actually, from the Bible. Proverbs 16:33, the lot is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord. And then a New Testament example, a relevant text there in Luke chapter 1. Once when Zechariah's division was on duty and he was serving as priest for God, he was chosen by lot, according to the custom of the priesthood, to go into the temple of the Lord and burn incense. Close quote. Now, casting a lot here simply means throwing a dice, throwing a die. I don't know, the different expressions in different parts of the world, but it just means throwing a dice, really. And there are many other examples of this in the Bible, although we do notice, by the way, of course, once Pentecost came and the Holy Spirit was given, and then after that you don't find any signs of the church throwing dice or casting lots, simply because the Holy Spirit was given to guide the church and Christians in the way they should go. But as it happens, this is just a point in passing, as it happens, this is not actually relevant to what we want to say this evening, because what I'm going to say is, anyway, evolution is not a chance process. Okay, but I wanted to put that in parenthesis just to highlight that point before we move on to look at more closely at this little word chance, which, as I say, is a bit of a slippery word. So I want to just review two main meanings of chance this evening. There are other meanings, but let's just keep to two to keep things relatively simple. And of course, they're both related to this question of uncertainty. The first is sometimes called epistemic chance, because it refers to all those events that are perfectly law-like in the way they happen, but about which we have insufficient knowledge of their antecedents to make predictions. For example, tossing a coin. I was reading actually some time ago, there's a research group at Stanford University who actually made a machine and calculated whether they could determine, just by looking at the very early stages of the coin tossing, whether they could actually work out whether it's going to be heads or tails, and they managed to make that machine do it quite successfully, actually. It's a law-like process. Okay, it's epistemic chance. I often wondered, actually, really, have they got time to do that at Stanford University? But that's another question. I won't go there. But anyway, there we are. But it's a sort of interesting point, isn't it? So Charles Darwin, in fact, and this is where I think he disagrees with William Provine, Charles Darwin was well aware that when he used the word chance in explaining his theory of evolution, he was using the word with its epistemic meaning. He writes here in the 6th edition of The Origin of Species, 1872, and he's writing about the variation that you see in animal and plants all over the place. And here I quote from Darwin, "I have hitherto sometimes spoken as if the variations were due to chance. This, of course, is a wholly incorrect expression, but it serves to acknowledge plainly our ignorance of the cause of each particular variation." Epistemic chance there. Right. Now, the second main type of chance we can call ontological chance, because there is, in principle, no antecedent knowledge that we can have about making any kind of prediction about when this particular event might happen, even in principle. So this is not a question of lack of knowledge, simply there is no knowledge that could be known in principle. That's it, that's ontological chance. Sometimes called pure chance, because nothing we can know which has predictive value. Contrast with the claim, maybe I can say, you know, it was pure chance I met John at the Granville market last Saturday. Right. Now, people might well understand what I mean in colloquial speech by making that sort of statement, but formally, I would be wrong, because there were antecedents that could be cited to explain our unexpected meeting. For example, John always goes to the market on Saturday morning, just like me. John always buys fresh vegetables at the market, just like me, and so forth. And so clearly, our meeting was therefore a chance event epistemically, but not ontologically. I hope that makes that sort of distinction clear. But if you want to think about ontological chance, then you really need to go, and I'm pressing the wrong button, let's go the other way. You really need to go to quantum mechanics or to go to radioactive decay. Think about something like phosphorus P32, a radioisotope on which I've spent much of my life working or using in my experiments. And so the non-radioactive form of phosphorus found most commonly in our bodies is phosphorus 31. It has just one less neutron than its radioactive P32 counterpart. And phosphorus 32 is made, like all these radioisotopes, in nuclear reactors, and then it decays, in this case, with a half-life of 14.3 days. So it goes down by a half every 14.3 days. And so even though the timing of each emission of each radioactive particle of energy is unknown, that's ontological chance, when you average out all those trillions of events happening, it gives a very consistent 14.3-day half-life. Okay. And of course, the same point holds for all the other radioisotopes. So I guess we can ask then the question whether this ontological chance, which is typified by quantum events, has any particular relevance to evolutionary biology. And the answer I want to give here is only indirectly without playing any kind of central role. And let me just qualify that statement. And so the reason is that in the vast majority of biological processes, including, to the best of our knowledge, the brain, specific single events at the quantum level don't make any difference at the functional level. That's the question we've got here. This is because the processes involve, for example, in the brain, the interaction of molecules, and each one of those molecules has properties which represent the average of trillions of quantum events. Okay, so we're looking at biological functions, we're looking at that sort of upper level. So in that sense, one single quantum event makes no particular difference to the organism. However, there are biological processes that clearly use quantum events within those processes. One I've shown there is photosynthesis. It's still a bit controversial, but probably there are specific quantum events that make a difference in photosynthesis. And there are others also which we could cite, things like vision, certain examples there, certainly the actions of various enzymes, specific quantum events that are important. And probably also, interestingly, the mechanism whereby animals navigate using the Earth's magnetic field. Again, a little bit controversial, but it looks quite possible, actually. But the point here, of course, is that in practice, at an upper level of functionality, then all these various aspects of the natural world around us are highly organized. Photosynthesis is going to happen, when the sun shines upon the chlorophyll in that particular plant or some of the bacteria that have chlorophyll. And so it doesn't really affect evolution per se. It's just part of the mechanisms, if you like, which are going on all the time in biology all around us in the natural world. Now, of course, we could do a thought experiment here, and we could say, well, that might be possible, but what about, let's take a line, let's call this line here line A, and let's ask the question, well, there was a photon of light came down, there was an emission of radioactive decay from outer space, and so had line A been out in the wild, maybe that would have hit line A and caused cancer. But maybe if line A had been inside a cave, it would have been protected from that bit of radioactive decay, and so its DNA would have been saved from mutations. But, if it wasn't saved from mutations, then, if it was saved from mutations, then it would have, if it kept alive longer didn't die from cancer, it would have killed lots of antelopes, killed these antelopes, and the particular expansion of the antelope population wouldn't have been the same. You can sort of track it down by a thought experiment and so on. And so the specific directory of evolution possibly could have been slightly different at that particular moment in time. You can make up a story like that, and you could say that's due to ontological chance in a way, although we will be going on to think in a moment how actually whatever sort of variation you get in the DNA doesn't really make any difference because of natural selection. So natural selection will be ensuring that overall that process is not one of chance. We'll come back to that other moment, at that other point in a moment. So let's just move on, though, and just take a look at this word random. So we've looked at two types of chance so far, epistemic and ontological. But the word random is also often thrown around, as we've been seeing in those quotations from secular commentators to justify their belief somehow that evolution is purposeless in some way. So random, so the word is used differently in biology as it is in mathematics, and that is the beginning of a problem. So when we biologists use the word random when we're referring to evolution, all we're saying is that changes happen in the DNA, variation happens in the DNA, that happens without reference to the benefit or otherwise of the animal organism in question. That's all it means, okay? So it's not used mathematically in biology, and that leads to some confusion. And so if we look at mathematics, of course, then it's rather different. So mathematicians typically use the word random to describe processes in which multiple outcomes can occur, and each is associated with a probability that gives the likelihood of that outcome. So, if we take a string of numbers, if the numbers are randomly selected, then any single number in a series will have an equal probability of being selected. And you can get that sort of random series using randomizers, which you can get on computers and so forth. And then a traditional statistical approach then examines each series of numbers to see whether they display the property of randomness. So you can't have a single number is not random. It's the process whereby you generate that sequence of numbers that can be judged to be random or not. And really you can only assess that using a very long list of numbers. And so no part of the series should provide any information about the properties of any other part of the series. So that's what mathematicians understand by randomness. So let's come back to biology and ask the question whether that's a feature of revolutionary mechanisms, evolutionary, what did I say, revolutionary? Evolutionary mechanisms. And the answer is no, actually not. And so the best place to look for that is that randomness might be in the mutational changes in the sequence of an organism's DNA. Now, you'll know that in the human genome, it's 3.2 billion genetic letters long, okay, 3.2 billion nucleotide bases, we call them, okay. And so if a mutation was genuinely random, then it should happen with equal probability anywhere in those 3.2 billion nucleotide bases. And the answer is it doesn't, right. And I'll just give you one example of that. I've got a summary there of a recent study down up there on the screen. So what they did was, this is a Dutch study. They took 250 family trios, mother, father, and baby, right? And they just sequenced the whole of their genome. Boom. 20 years ago, you could have done that too expensive. Now you can do it for less than $1,000. Really amazing, actually. And they sequenced the whole genome, and they found that there was an average 38 new mutations that appeared in the newborn. By the way, the number goes up depending on the age of the father, just to make that point. But anyway, and So the question then was to see whether these mutations were randomly distributed throughout the genome, and if you thought that was the case, then they should be separated by a mean of 84 million. You just divide 3.2 billion by 38 and you get something like 84 million nucleotides. Okay, on average, that should be the case. Do you see that? No, you don't. Okay. What they found was there were 78 instances in which there were clusters of 2 to 3 mutations found within 20,000 nucleotides, genetic letters of each other. Okay. In other words, they're clustered around all over the place, but they're not random. And that has sort of been known for a long time, really, but this is a rather rigorous human experiment, if you like, human observation. You can do it much more quickly and easily in yeast. Here's an example from yeast, where yeast replicate very rapidly, and they just gave it a mutagen, some nasty toxic thing, and just to cause mutations. And then they sprayed out the chromosomes, as you can see there, of the yeast. And you can see that there's quite a cluster there in chromosome number 2. And the other mutations in the yellow bars, those are the yellow bars, you can see they're really not, they're not random. Okay. Anyway, it's just to make the point. So, yeah, so random, it depends. You have to be careful about the use of that word. But the mutations aren't random when they happen in organisms. Right. Now, we can now go on then to ask a further question. What types of chance are involved in generating genetic variation? Now, clearly, there's lots of epistemic chance here. Most of the mutations, most of the genetic variation in our genomes happen through replication. As cells divide, they just make errors, and so those errors can accumulate, although we also have wonderful DNA repair enzymes as well to make sure there aren't too many errors there. But once we start averaging large numbers, then we can make some fairly well-justified generalizations about what kind of chromosomes, which chromosomes are more likely to undergo mutations, structural changes, and so on and so forth. And the molecular mechanisms involved in the mutation load that you get in the genome, in the DNA, just follow the rules, follow the laws of physics and chemistry. And if there were no variation at all, of course, there would be no evolution. We wouldn't be here. Okay. But if you get too much, if there were no repair enzymes, then our DNA would just fill up with mutations, and we'd soon be dead anyway. So there's a kind of a titration, there's a sort of thermostat, if you want to call it a mutational thermostat, that sort of keeps the level of variations more or less in the right sort of range. In fact, it's been estimated that at least 10,000 DNA damage events occur every day in every cell of our human bodies. That's a very cheerful thought to think about. Okay, so we have around something like 10 to the 13 cells in our bodies, and you can do the calculation, I'm sure in your head. You multiply 10 to the 13 and you multiply that by 10,000, you get quite a big number. And so fortunately, of course, the DNA repair enzymes, we've got at least 10, many different repair enzymes, and they're very efficient at cleaning up those mutations as they happen. We've made thousands, I've made thousands, you've made thousands of mutations in your DNA since walking into this chapel this evening. And of course, we've also made many miles of DNA by replication. Again, multiply 10 to the 13 times all the cells in your body that are dividing and replicating, and it's we have 2 meters. If you stretch out the DNA in any single cell, it's about 2 meters. Okay, you can't do it because it'll break, but it's pretty amazing how it's packaged into the cells of our body. So DNA is really pretty amazing, but it doesn't necessarily generate any kind of theory of chance for evolution. But that was epistemic chance we were talking about there. Let's just think a little bit about ontological chance. Right, so we've already noticed the radioactive particles, when emitted, we can't predict when specifically they're going to happen, so that's a good example of quantum uncertainty. We cannot predict that precise timing of that even in principle. And we know that ionizing radiation causes mutations in DNA by directly breaking the chemical bonds that hold the genetic letters, those nucleotides, together. But it's impossible, even in principle, to predict the timing or to say what specific bit of DNA that mutation is going to happen. So could this then contribute to the idea that evolution is the theory of chance? Again, I want to say not really, because natural selection, as I was saying earlier, acts as this kind of stringent sieve that selects which mutations will be maintained in a population and which will be discarded. And so that sieve operates on any kind of genetic variation. It doesn't matter where the genetic variation comes from. It doesn't matter if it comes from epistemic chance or whether it comes from ontological chance. Still natural selection is going to operate if the mutation makes any change in the phenotype and the anatomy, behavior, functionality of that particular organism. So let's just remind ourselves of what natural selection is really doing. And here's just a standard definition. This one's from Francisco Ayala, I see. Quote from him: "Natural selection is the differential reproduction of alternative genetic variations determined by the fact that some variations are beneficial because they increase the probability that the organisms having them will live longer or be more fertile than organisms having alternative variations. Over the generations, beneficial variations will be preserved and multiplied. Injurious or less beneficial variations will be eliminated." Close quote. A bit of a long definition, but it's good to get the understanding of that right. Now, of course, often variation in the genome, in the DNA, is neutral. It really doesn't make any difference at all to the organism. In fact, mostly, I mentioned that your new baby will have 38 new mutations that you don't find in the mother or in the father. No need to worry. There are nearly all of them in areas of the DNA that just don't make any difference anyway, so don't worry about it. But when the genetic variation does make a difference to the organism for either good or for bad, from the organism's point of view, then the organism will tend to leave over many generations more offspring. That particular set of genetic variants will be passed on to the next generation, and that's in biology what we call reproductive success. And so that's the core idea, really, in evolutionary theory when it comes to natural selection. And those beneficial changes, in fact, if you have a sort of tight population, they will spread through the population pretty quickly if they're quite beneficial to those particular animals, organisms, or whatever they might be. And that's a process known as a selective sweep, not a sweepstake, that's different. A selective sweep, as the gene is spread around, the beneficial gene is spread through that population. And there are many examples of that in humans going on right now, especially genes that protect you against nasty pathogens, that sort of thing. Right, so it should by now be clear, I hope, why it doesn't really matter whether variation comes into the genome via the pathway of epistemic chance, that's most of it, or whether it comes in by ontological chance, as in radiation effects. As in both cases, the effects of natural selection are most influential in bringing about certain constrained outcomes. And so in that sense, natural selection is like the potter sort of molding the clay. And so over a long period of time, the consequences of genetic variation are sort of molded by the potter of natural selection into a slightly different collection of phenotypes in an interbreeding population. The population begins to change. And there are hundreds and hundreds of examples of that, of course, as people study biological populations. Now, so far, we've been looking mainly at evolution at the molecular level, whereas, of course, most zoologists are studying animals and plants and things at the upper level, at the population level. And I just want to pause on this level as well, because at this level as well, there are many findings which undermine the idea that evolutionary process as a whole is a process of chance. And one of the main examples here, one example you can take, and that is the example of constraint in the evolutionary process, and that is typified by the process of convergence, evolutionary convergence. So if evolution was a random or a chance process, using the words in a sort of popular understanding of those words in daily speech, then you might expect that animals or plants would invariably find different adaptive solutions to living in certain places. But that's usually not what happens, actually, or very often it doesn't happen. And the reason is they are coping with that particular ecological niche by evolving similar bits of anatomy or biochemical pathway or even behaviors which are converged. They're converging on a common solution to the challenge of living in this particular planet with this particular environment, and they come up with the same solutions. They converge on the same adaptive solution. And there are hundreds and hundreds of examples of that particular phenomenon. Many of them, by the way, have been studied by a professor of paleobiology from my own university, Simon Conway-Morris, who's written some really good books on that. If you're interested, I would recommend his books in particular. But when he first started going on about this, people kind of weren't really convinced, but now it's become a part of really mainstream biology. It's nothing particularly controversial about it. It's just simply, yep, that's the way things are. And just to take one example, you can take the evolution of the eye. Darrell Darwin just thought the evolution of the eye was a real problem for his theory. How could it be such a complicated thing, entity could come into being? Now it's the other way around. The evolution of the eye is often just used as a classic example of how evolution comes up with the same solution to living on a planet of light and darkness. In fact, 96% of all animal species contain a complex optical system. There are 10 main types of eye, but the two we know best probably are the camera eyes, like our own, and also compound eyes. And despite their complexity, both types of eye actually have evolved many, many times in quite different evolutionary lineages, maybe more than 40 times actually. When we talk about different evolutionary lineages, we're talking about ones that historically are known to be separated, or that different continents that would never come together, separated by thousands of miles of ocean, whatever it might be. And so the camera eyes, as you probably, those who aren't biologists will remember from your school biology, that refers to this sort of pinhole camera idea that we've got up there on the screen. Light comes down, hits the retina, sends all the nerve impulses down to the bit of your brain at the back of the head there, which then integrates it all and comes up with vision in a very remarkable way. So it's a complex system, but it's just converged, evolved many, many times independently. And here's just one example of that, which has been known for a very long time, and that is, in fact, it's been recognized, I think, for more than a century. And that is a similarity in the camera eyes, between the camera eyes of cephalopods like squid and octopus, and the eyes of vertebrates like us, human eye. And let's just look at that. The similarities are very striking. These have evolved independently. And, okay, there's some interesting differences as well. In fact, the octopus eye is better than ours in some ways, but the basic structure, the basic outline, the basic system, if you like, of a camera eye is the same. Convergence, separated in this case by millions of years of evolutionary time. But it's also, I think, important to think about convergence also at the molecular level. And I'm sorry to give you molecules at this time of night, and it's a bit difficult. But last week in Cambridge, we had our termly public lecture. We have Faraday public lectures like this sort of one here this evening 3 times a year, and we choose a nice place to have them. And we had somebody called Professor Art Louis came to speak to us about his current research at the University of Oxford. He's a physicist who's gone more in the biophysics direction. And here's an example. I just want to explain what they're doing. It's quite interesting, actually. So what you see there, the structure there is an RNA molecule. In this case, it's a ribozyme. A ribozyme is an RNA molecule that has this secondary structure and tertiary structure that enables it to act as an enzyme, as well as being a self-replicating molecule in principle anyway. And so quite a few people think that ribozymes played an important role in the origin of life. Simply, you've got to get life started somehow. How did that happen? Well, if you get a molecule that can replicate as well as enzymatically catalyze its own replication, then that sort of gives you a head start, if you like. Okay. But the question then is, well, how on earth do you get to a sequence like that? Okay, so RNA is like DNA. It's just got one genetic letter, which is different. But otherwise, in RNA, there are many, many different types of RNA in our bodies and in all living things, which have lots of different functions. But here, let's say you've got an RNA molecule that's 126 nucleotides long, genetic letters long. Okay, that's all. It's not that long. Okay. But remember, it's got 4 different genetic letters in there, 4 of them. Now, if you randomize a molecule like that with 4 letters, 126 nucleotides long, then what you can get is 10 to the 75 different possible structures. That's a big number, okay? That's 1 with 75 zeros after it. That is a seriously big number. In fact, even if you have 1 molecule of each of those possibilities, that would be more than the mass of the known universe. Okay, so that's a big number. Then you scratch your head and say, hey, that's a big puzzle. Well, how on earth can you get origin of life, when you've got, so many different possibilities? And so what Art Louis and his colleagues have done is Art Louis, and his question is, well, how do functional RNA molecules appear? Because you need a very specific sequence of RNA, of these genetic letters, to get the functionality. How do you get there? If the process was completely random, you're never going to get there, obviously, because, there are just too many possibilities. Okay. And the answer that Art Louis and his research group in Oxford have found is, well, it's not random. Okay, it's not random. And this, as I say, has been shown quite recently by him, and he gave us his up-to-date results just a week ago. What's today? About a week ago, actually. Yeah. And so what they did was they dived into this. There's an RNA database online called RNA Central. Sounds like a train station. It's not. But this is where people put all their structures of all their functional RNA molecules. So they're all in there. And first of all, they went fishing around in there. And what they discovered was that the structures of all the functional RNA molecules that are found in this huge, great big database actually only have somewhere between 1,000 and 100,000 genetic letter sequences that account for all the RNA shapes that you find in living things. Okay, well, that shows you that it's highly selective, and there's a lot of selection going on there. But it still doesn't really answer you, how do you get there? Okay, it's remarkable because what it's saying is that out of that, let's say 10 to the 75 or some huge number of possible structures in the RNA database, which is the functional RNA molecules that we know about today, then there are something between 1,000 and 100,000 genetic letter sequences that account for all the RNA shapes that you find in living things. Well, that's pretty remarkable in itself. But the next bit of their work is even more remarkable. So what they did was they said, well, let's just take the 4 genetic letters of RNA, and let's just randomize them. Let's say we take 126 or whatever length you want, 80, and we take a length and we just randomize those, and we'll see, which sort of structures they come up with and what happens. And what they discovered was that the RNA shapes they recovered from the set of random RNA sequences were the same as those that occur for the RNA molecules found in living things. It's quite remarkable, isn't it? As Art was saying, it's like a haystack. If I put a haystack there, you want to find a needle in a haystack? Pretty hard. He says it's like putting your arm in the haystack, and every time you put it in, you find a needle. You find another needle. So what they're doing is that they're showing that randomization, there's something intrinsic about the the actual nucleotide bases, when they're randomized together, when the way they've joined up together chemically and the way they fold, that actually leads you to, with much greater chance than statistically likely, to these structures that we already know are functional RNA molecules out there in life, in all the different forms of life. So that is their finding. And I think that's kind of interesting, because what it tells you is that, well, if you're thinking about the origin of life, it doesn't tell you the answer to that. That's a big unknown question right now, but it tells you that there are it's biased, if you like. The way the chemistry and physics is set up is biased in a way, in a direction that makes it more likely that you will get the molecules that are useful in the origin of life and the emergence of life on planet Earth. And so, it doesn't look like chance. I think I've got time. I just want to tell you one more. I'll give you one more example, because that came out 4 days ago. That was last week, okay? And I'll give you an example that came out May the 22nd. What's the date today? I don't know, a few days ago anyway. This is an interesting example. So this is an example of this published, which is demonstrates the inheritance of acquired characteristics. And this was done on rice by a Chinese group from Beijing, headed up by Dr. Shanji Tang. And what they did was, so they got a strain of rice that it's an Asian rice that was particularly sensitive to the cold. Okay. And so they started growing it in the lab, and they exposed it to a temperature of minus 15 degrees centigrade. In other words, not many survived, okay? They had a whole field of rice growing in the lab, if you like. And so then what they did was they took they measured how successful these different individual rice plants were, and how many seeds, how many valid, how many fertile seeds they could derive from and get from them, and so forth. And they selected the ones that did best at minus 15 degrees, and then they took them off to another lab. They grew another sort of little mini field of this new strain, if you like, of rice. And then they carried it on. And by the third generation, they discovered that this particular strain actually was producing more rice, fertile seeds of rice in a consistent way. And even when they then carried on for another 5 generations, it still carried on doing that. Now that time was much too quick. 3 generations is much too fast to get any DNA variation that would explain that. Okay, now, and they showed that, they sequenced the DNA of rice. Okay, they sequenced it to make sure that was the case. I can see the referees asking them for that experiment. And so what they found was that actually it was due to an epigenetic change in the rice. Epigenetic simply refers to the chemical modification of DNA itself, or the proteins surrounding the DNA that influence the switching on and off and so on. And they found that there was a gene which they called acquired cold tolerance 1, and that was the epigenetic change which was then inherited by the succeeding generations of that particular strain of rice. And that was an interesting example of the inheritance of acquired characteristics. And, that really almost looks Lamarckian. It's not quite Lamarckian, but it's sort of in that direction. But again, I just pointed out as an illustration that this is not chance, okay, in this particular case. And probably the inheritance of acquired characteristics is much more likely than has been realized until now. Okay, just one other example. So what we've shown so far, what I want to conclude so far, all the people quoted at the beginning of the talk, both secular and Christian, are just wrong. Okay? Evolution is not a chance process, and the point here is it's really important to understand the science that you're trying to use ideologically before you start planting ideologies into it. Okay? It just doesn't work in the case of evolution. Now, as it happens, Richard Dawkins, an atheist, agrees on this particular point. I just want to be fair here. He actually wrote in the preface to his book, The Blind Watchmaker, he wanted to make the point that one of the reasons for writing this book is that evolution is not a theory of chance. So he agrees, And I wanted to make that point to be fair on some of the secular thinkers also. And by the way, just thinking of Richard Dawkins, this is in parenthesis, I think it was mentioned that recently Alistair McGrath and I kept coming across people who had come to Christian faith from atheistic or agnostic backgrounds, mostly through the new atheists, people like the late Christopher Hitchens or Richard Dawkins, people like that. And so we decided to gather their essays together. So 12 essays in this book, which explain, their different backgrounds and what happened to them. These people come from 5 different countries, very different backgrounds, not all scientists by any means. It's quite an interesting read, so I recommend that book for you. And I was delighted just a few days ago, by the way, one of the authors of that book wrote to me and said, "Oh, did you see that Richard Dawkins was just asked about the book in an interview?" And they put the front cover up on the screen. That's from YouTube, okay? And I thought, that's wonderful, isn't it? Great, good on them. So Mark Ridley there was interviewing Richard Dawkins on whichever side of the screen he's on, about what he thinks about the book Coming to Faith Through Dawkins. So there we are. That's just by parenthesis. But it's sort of interesting that in the UK at the moment, this is a little bit by the side, but there's a sort of, it's been called a quiet revival going on in my country. And that's due to some recent big YouGov poll showing that the number of people going to church has gone up over the past few years. It's gone up by about 2 million regular churchgoers in the past, just since 2019. It's quite interesting. And quite a lot of these people are actually coming from this very strong atheistic background. And anyway, I just put that in passing. Okay, so conclusions is evolution is not a theory of chance. And far from evolution being a threat to Christian faith, I think I would like to call it a wonderful theodrama. Other people have called it a theodrama. It's highly consistent with a creator God, the author of creation, who has intentions and purposes for the world. Purposes with a big P. We've been talking about purpose, and I want to make sure I finish by 1:30, and so I'm going to jump through this a little bit quickly, but I think it's just worth mentioning that, again, purpose is a bit of a slippery word, like chance. You've got purpose with a small p, which is all over the place in biology. The purpose for a wing is flying, the purpose for a mouth is eating, and on you can go with a small p. But then you've got the metaphysical big P purpose. The universe we observe have precisely the properties we should expect. If there is a bottom, no design, no purpose. That's a quote we had from, that's actually a quote from Dawkins, as it happens, similar from Dennett. And that's metaphysical purpose. So what they're doing here is trying to extract metaphysical big P purpose from the small p purpose, and so forth. Things that don't have any purpose, we're familiar with, pebbles on a beach. Nah, they don't have any purpose. Remember some older people here, remember the old-fashioned TV screens, all that fuzzy bit? Nope, it doesn't have any purpose. And lots of examples of purposeless things. Okay, but as we come to Christian theology, then I think we can see the biological history of life on this planet, where we see God, the author of creation, bringing about purpose with a big P. And I want to say that evolution is perfectly consistent with at least that big P purpose. You look at the overall sweep of evolutionary history, which has been going on for about 3.5 billion years, something like that. If you just track it through, these wonderful steps going on, multicellular life forms, Cambrian explosion, things get bigger, finally human brains getting along, emergence of mind, and you can track the whole thing down, and it's really a wonderful it's a theodrama, which I find very exciting and fits, I think, very well with the Christian understanding of God's purpose with a big P. So this long history then has brought about all the facets of our human personalities, people who have free choices, who make decisions, who worship, who respond to God's love. We have all these capacities given to us by evolution. Capacities are not the same as reality. We have to practice the realities. We have to make that decision for our own lives as to whether we're going to enjoy fellowship with God and experience all that our capacities has enabled us to do. And so when I look at evolution, I've spent a long time trying to show it's not a theory of chance. I think that's important. And so really the people trying to extrapolate a purposeless universe, I don't think can get very far on that. And as a Christian, I see it deeply embedded with purpose, and we can discuss that more in a moment. I wanted to just flag up, I have brought along, as mentioned, a few books, and I brought them along at a special price, some of them half price actually. And so I've done a deal here with Alex in the bookshop here, although we're undercutting some of his prices. But there are a few copies left of Creation and Evolution. Do we have to choose if you're interested more in the broader theological questions which evolution brings about? But I want to mention particularly, is there purpose in biology? Because that really is the topic for us evening. It's quite a cheap, heavily reduced book there. And Are We Slaves to Our Genes? If you're interested in the role of genetic diversity in our own behavior, human behaviors, that's what that book is about. And then The Works of the Lord came out just 2 weeks ago, and there's a wonderful collection of biblical meditations by scientists and people in technology reflecting on different passages of Scripture, which I recommend to you. Last but not least, and I'm finishing, sir, welcome to Cambridge. If you want to come to Cambridge, we have a summer course, summer school, and the first week of July. Cambridge is a very nice place in June to come. Okay, Science, Religion, and Justice. The website is up there. I'll leave it up there if you want to have a look. It is hybrid. You can get there online as well, but you need to book pretty soon. If you want to come physically, you have to do it pretty quick. But a lot of people really enjoy the broad range of speakers we have for those courses. So I just flagged that up at the end. Thank you for your attention. Over to you for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Denis, for a fascinating lecture, and I wish to commend you for the way you handled a complex subject matter with making it accessible and understandable for us. So well done. I trust that there might be questions here in the audience or online. For those of you who are present here in the chapel, we have 2 microphones, one on either side. We would ask you to make your way to the microphones to ask your question so that it can be heard by everyone here and also captured on the recording. And for those of you who are online and those who are here and have your phone not buzzing or making a noise, but able to text a question, it's questions@regent-college.edu. So with that, I see a gentleman has moved his way to the back. So if you have a question, please be our first. Thank you.
Denis, thank you very much for a brilliant and amazingly packed lecture. Even if the room isn't totally packed, your lecture was packed with facts and interest. And I don't want to push you too far in the direction of something you didn't intend to talk about. You did mention once or twice the origin of life, but you always had the writer on planet Earth. However, there are potentially 10 to the 22 planet-bearing suns in our galaxy and perhaps 10 to the 22 galaxies in the observable universe. So maybe planet Earth is too narrow a focus for questions about the origin of life. Have you thought about the connection between the origin of life and then the evolutionary development of life? I'd be really interested in your insights.
And sorry, the punchline at the end was the distinction between the two. Was it the distinction between the two or the, I missed on word, keyword?
Well, really the relationship between
the relationship between the two.
Between the origin of life,
yes,
which scientists seem to have very little knowledge about.
Yes.
And the evolution of life, which they have a great deal of knowledge about.
Yes,
as exhibited this evening. Thanks.
Right, so, well, clearly these are 2 distinct things. So, I mean, evolution begins when you have a replication molecule. And that's when you can get, evolution starts when you have selection on a particular molecule that is able to replicate and to pass on that particular variation that's involved in the molecule. Now, so one point I didn't really highlight, because I was trying to speed up a little bit, with the findings from Art Louis there from Oxford. So that was not a case of natural selection, and he he would really highlight this point, okay? So in other words, when you randomize all those RNA molecules, and then bingo, you come up with, ones that have the structures that are already known to have function in the biological world. That is not natural selection. That is simply chemistry. That is biochemistry, okay? And so that's an interesting point. So I think but to come to the main part of your question, I think, yeah, it's important to say that the Origin of Life, we have an Origin of Life Institute now in Cambridge that started up a few years ago. You know, it's full of physicists, biophysicists, computer people. You know, it's not full of biologists, okay? Biology begins when you get replication molecules and when you get living organisms, okay? Then you got, that's where biological evolution can start. Origin of life is not really about evolution, although it's often just talked about in a rather sort of general way, as if it's all part of the evolutionary process. Not really, no, it's something, it's different, okay? It's how you get a collection of molecules together that will give you replicating organisms that in a stable way that you can actually pass on information to the next generation or the next cells, whatever. And as you rightly pointed out, and that's a huge gap in our knowledge right now. I just feel they're very brave, these people working in the Origin of Life, because, you know, it's such a difficult field to be in. I mean, but on the other hand, when I say that, there have been some very remarkable advances, actually, in the past 10, 20, 30 years. And we have speakers on that topic at the Faraday Institute. We had a seminar just at the end of last year, I think it was, by one of the people from that institute, who's a Christian, by the way. And yeah, it was quite interesting, encouraging to see the advances being made. My personal prejudice, and I speak here as a biochemist really by roots, is that, you know, if we find, I think we will find life on other planets. So it's just a question of time. You know, how long it will take, I don't know. But I'd love it to be in my lifetime. But I have a feeling that we will. Well, it's more than a feeling. It's just based on the periodic table. Everywhere we look in the universe, the chemistry is the same. The physics is the same everywhere we look. And because of that, I think it's very likely that the life forms that we find will be quite similar, you know, to life forms we have here. Because if you get these particular environments anyway, and this particular carbon compounds and so forth, there's far more carbon compounds up there in space than there are down here on planet Earth. There's carbon all over the place. And some of the carbon compounds right up there in stellar space are quite complicated ones, actually. And, you know, we can see those all over the place. And so the universe is full of carbon. And because of that, I think carbon-based life is the most likely, simply because it's all over the place, as far as the universe we can see anyway, okay, the known universe we can see. Now, of course, we have to remind ourselves we only see 4% of the universe. Dark matter, dark energy, 96%. You know, so I mean, we're only looking at 4%, and so that we have to bear in mind as well, but that's something that physicists can worry about.
Thank you very much indeed.
Denis, thank you for that answer. Denis, thank you for that question. And, we do have, I guess, an online question. I was going to ask this Denis if he had a follow-up question, but Pablo, we have an online question. We'll let you give that, and then the gentleman coming up behind you.
Yes, we do have an online question coming from Arnold, and he asks, you have argued evolution is not a chance process, but does this mean it is a deterministic process, or that God is directing the process? In general, what metaphysical, philosophical, or religious perspectives are opened up by the conclusion that evolution is not a chance process?
Right, thank you very much. Yeah, I wanted to spend more time on that, and I could see the time was running out. What I think, you know, looking just simply at the evolutionary process, I don't think you can derive purpose with a big P, just looking at it like that. I think that's above the pay grade of what, you know, biology can deliver for you. I would rather look at it the other way around. To me, when I look at the evolutionary process, it undermines the idea that biology is necessarily purposeless. I'm being really careful with my words here. And so if you look at those people that we were quoting from at the beginning of the lecture, Dennett and William Provine and people like that, they're kind of saying it's necessarily purposeless, okay, when you look at it. And I want to say, well, it doesn't look like that to me, okay? Not necessarily purposeless. Does that mean I can derive a purpose from it? No, I don't think so, and it's not, you can't really do that. However, as a Christian, when I take my Christian worldview of God as creator who has a purpose, big P, purpose for the universe, there's a purpose for our own lives and so on, then I find it quite easy to baptize, if you like, incorporate evolutionary process within God's purposes for the universe. Yeah, I think it fits very well, actually. And I've got a whole chapter on that in that book, Is There Purpose in Biology? So, and I think, well, personally, Darwin, of course, had a strong theological background. He studied theology at Cambridge and passed his exams and all that. But, so he was imbued with natural theology from his own background, as he says in an autobiography, actually. William Paley was the person who really had an influence on him while he was doing his time in Cambridge. So I think all of that, sort of, you look at that and you can see how evolution is, it fits, I think, very well as a matter of story, as a big story about how God fulfills his purposes. But I don't think you can extract it you can't extract that from the process itself, if you see the distinction I'm trying to make now, if that makes sense.
Yes, please, thank you.
So from what I've heard so far, it seems that you take for granted that there is evolution. I think I would like to challenge you on that, in that even Darwin would say that there needs to be evidence for his theory to be correct. In other words, there would have to be transitional lives that would then evolve to a higher life organism like humans. So if there is no evidence, other than not what you're suggesting as a hypothesis, rather than supported by actual evidence of transitional life forms. For example, Cambridge, 500 odd million years ago, all of a sudden, all of these phenotypes appeared instantaneously with no evidence of transitions in between, say 3.5 billion years to 500 million years ago. So how do you explain evolution if there's no transitional?
Yeah, I mean, I'm probably, okay, that's a whole other area. I mean, trying to persuade anybody about why the evolutionary theory is well justified by the evidence would take at least another hour or 2 hours or 3 hours. Okay, I know I probably can't achieve that in this time. I think, people have to make up their own minds, and if you don't feel there's enough evidence, okay. I'm not going to try and stand here and persuade somebody that why I think evolutionary theory is the best valid theory. Well, what I can say sociologically, it is the theory that holds the whole of biology together, and the whole of medicine together, and the whole of biomedicine together, and we operate in the biological scientific community within this particular framework that makes sense of the data that we have. And I would say personally, the evidence is overwhelming and the transitional forms are overwhelming. Well, okay, I will give you one example, Tiktaalik, about Tiktaalik in the Upper Devonian. People actually went to look this is not far from here actually, a bit further north. Where are we? I don't know which way, it's far north anyway, but which is far north from here. And there was a research group that actually was interested in looking at the intermediate between the land animals and fish and all that sort of thing. And they really thought, let's look at the Upper Devonian because that's a good place to look. And they discovered this Tiktaalik, which is really like a, it's like a fish with legs wandering around. If you just Google Tiktaalik, I think it's for the local language. That's why they use that particular thing. It's a wonderful transitional form, actually. But I'll just give that as one example. There are hundreds of others, actually. But I can't spend the time here to try and persuade you evolution is really a great theory, but that has to be another discussion, I think, for another day. So.
Thank you for the question. Bill, please.
2 questions. First of all, thank you for the lecture. Richard, you'll find a whole bunch of cobwebs in my row there because they all got ripped out by the lecture. Thank you. Two questions to sort of the summary of where I think you went. The first one is, you mentioned that people have misused evolutionary biology. In terms of those who understand it, so your peer group, is your view controversial at this point that evolution is not necessarily without purpose? I think you ended up saying that it's not the case that it must be purposeless. Is that controversial?
Is it controversial? I think that, well, I don't know. I don't know the sociology of that. I mean, clearly, an interesting example, someone who is much more prominent in this field is the person I mentioned, Professor Simon Comey-Morris. And when he started publishing on convergence, this is what, 20 years ago? That was deemed to be controversial. And partly the reason was that he was also clearly hinting, that, so there was a great discussion going on between Simon Comey-Morris and Stephen Jay Gould. Okay, so Stephen Jay Gould was famous, the recent professor of evolutionary biology from Harvard, who, by the way, published Simon's work and quite clearly saying this is Simon's work on the Cambrian, about the Cambrian explosion, in his book called This Wonderful Life. When did that come out? Back in the 1970s. I remember reading it on a ferry boat between Beirut and Cyprus. Funnily enough, it's funny how you remember when you read books, okay. But anyway, but that sort of led to, that there was quite an active discussion, quite fiery one at times, between Simon and Stephen Jay Gould. Because Stephen Jay Gould kept saying, well, if you replay the tape of life again, you'll get something quite different. We would never be here. We're a chance process. He had this great sort of narrative, you see, about this. And Simon kept saying, nope, it's not what it looks like, okay? When you actually look at convergence, it doesn't look like that at all. And so Simon was a bit naughty, but his Cambridge University Press book, about the first book he had about convergence, saying it had a subtitle, what was it? Let's see if I can remember it. Lonely, inevitable human in a lonely universe, okay? Now that was really, making a point towards Stephen Jay Gould, actually. What he was trying to say, look, if you replay the shape of life again, you won't get exactly the same, but you'll get something probably a bit like us. That was his point. When you actually look at convergence and the tight regulation, the evolution is a very tightly regulated process. It's a very organized process. And so, that was controversial, I would say, and by even hinting that that was hinted immediately there was a purpose, big P, okay, as well. And he got quite a lot of flack from that. But what's interesting, actually, I saw Simon just last week. We have a dinner discussion after our public lectures, and Simon was there, and he was just remarking how non-controversial convergence is now. Now, Richard Dawkins, he's got books full of examples of convergence. Atheist, Christian, it doesn't matter, what one's worldview is. It's simply a fact of biological life, if you like, history of biological life. But if you extrapolate out of that, some kind of purpose with a big P, that certainly would be controversial, I think. Right. So people go, So that's why I'm careful to say I'm not extracting from that purpose with a big P myself. I don't want to do that. But I do want to say that undermines any idea that it's necessarily purposeless. Okay?
Yes.
It's just sort of undermining that idea.
Thank you for the description. And if I can slip in a second one. When we take a lecture like tonight and we go home and we're trying to think, okay, what do I do with that? And particularly in relationship to our own devotion, I suppose, what is your experience? It seems to me that the challenge is that somehow we need to give God the time that it takes for these processes to happen. And maybe that means that we don't put ourselves as humans at the center of the story in the same way, but put God at the center of the story, and then humans come along after millions and billions of years. And is that what you found Christians need to do with this news that God's been at work for this long? Well,
it's interesting, isn't it? When we go to several chapters of Job, other chapters in Isaiah, and certainly the Psalms, Psalm 104 and so on, we see God reveling in the biological diversity. And you know, not just humans, okay? So I think sometimes Christians can end up thinking, you know, this biology, it's lovely, you know, but really, what it's all about is us being here, okay,
right,
tarantara, okay, so, but you don't really find that in Scripture, because Scripture is just, you know, the lions roar seeking their food from God, Psalm 104, and then you got, there's lovely chapters, and as I mentioned in Job, you know, rejoicing about all these amazing things out there in biology, what we now call biology, in the natural world. So I think we have to be careful here that God, you know, the new heavens and the new earth, often there's a discussion about will there be animals, and some people think there will be every single animal that ever lived will be there. I'm not sure about that, but, you know, we're not told that, you know, but I think it'll be part, the biological diversity will be there, you know, it's all part of God's wonderful creation. So I think that's important, that we see a God who loves diversity and loves this wonderful spread of, you know, the natural world all around us, of which we humans are part of. And, you know, we're all there on day 6 together with the animals, okay, so we're clustered together in that way. So that's the direction I would want to go with in that, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Dennis. We certainly have time for one more question, and so our friend here, Pablo, are there any other online questions? There is one more. Okay, we'll have your question and squeeze in one more online question. That will be it for the night.
Thank you. I'm very grateful to be here. I walked in by chance today at Regent College, and really enjoyed, especially since I've been reading a lot of Teilhard de Chardin, his work. And I'm wondering how would you evaluate his contribution to this discussion?
Well, can you say his name again, because I didn't hear inherit.
Okay. He's a Jesuit paleontologist called Teilhard de Chardin.
Oh, Teilhard de Chardin, oui. Yeah. Yes. So Teilhard de Chardin, yes, has been very influential, especially in Catholic circles, but in other circles as well. I mean, there's a slight problem, if people are familiar with his sort of big picture, was that he would take evolution, you know, and then say it's leading onwards and upwards to this, what he called the omega point.
Yeah. And
the omega point is somehow identified with Christ, you know, that somehow it's all leading to this wonderful conclusion, as it were. There's a slight problem. So Teilhard de Chardin was Lamarckian. So Lamarckian is the theory of acquired characteristics, okay? And again, it's a bit of a complicated story, and so Lamarck came before Darwin, as you probably know, and so he's had this theory of evolution, but it was like a sort of, almost like an escalator going up each step on the way, and each step would lead to another step, lead to another step. That was because you had the inheritance of these wonderful acquired characteristics, Okay, so, and that sort of then leads you onwards and upwards to this sort of omega point, you see. The escalator keeps going up into the cosmic sphere, if you like, you know, to the omega point. So you get that in Teilhard de Chardin. And the problem is, of course, that Lamarckian evolution didn't really win the day, that, as we've been saying. Now, it's sort of coming back through the back door a little bit. That's why I gave that example of rice, actually. And very briefly, which is sort of Lamarckian, semi-Lamarckian, it's not really Lamarckian, but anyway, semi-Lamarckian. But so I think it's a bit dangerous to build your theology on a theory that turns out probably not to be correct. And that, again, is where you have to be cautious, I think, about where we are at the moment, you know, with our understanding of evolution. We don't want to build our theology on it, okay? And I would say the same about Teilhard. We have to be cautious about that. That was my main comment I would want to make there. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Keep it brief.
Dennis, I have one question. Did our friend really come to Regent today by chance?
Well, epistemically. Yeah.
Pablo, the final question tonight from an online guest.
Yes, we have another online question. You noted the lion cancer case doesn't really support the idea of chance in evolution. But what about the significant impact, pun intended, meteor crashing into Earth resulting in the demise of dinosaurs had on the last resulting biological changes for millions of years? Would that not rightly be considered a chance event affecting evolution?
I didn't get all of that, but I think I know what the question is, and you correct me if I'm wrong, that, yeah, there was this huge meteor that crashed down in the Gulf of Mexico and created a big hole, and a huge tsunami swept around the world and caused or was thought to cause the demise of the extinction of the dinosaurs. And is that a chance process? I think that was the question, wasn't it? Yeah, okay. No, that's a good question. Yeah, so, well, it was definitely epistemically chance. Of course, it was only epistemic. I mean, we know the circulation of meteors, we know the gravity, we know, you can track them around if they're going to hit the Earth or not, and that sort of thing. But was it epistemically chance? Absolutely, yeah, like so many of the millions and millions of epistemic chance events that changed the direction of evolution. Actually, Simon, just coming back to Simon Conway-Morris again, who's much more of an expert on that point than I am, he said, well, look, the dinosaurs were going to go extinct anyway. Now, there's quite a theory, actually, there's a lot of volcanic activity at the time, so some people think it wasn't really so much that would kill off the dinosaurs, it was more volcanic activity. It was probably both and, all kinds of things going on. But as Simon says, that sort of size creature doesn't last very long, actually. That is to say, the species doesn't last very long. All species go extinct, including us. Okay, so, 99% of all the species of the world have gone extinct that ever lived, okay? So, that's part of life on planet Earth, that you may not last as long as you think. So it just speeded up the extinction, but did it really make a big difference? Well, it made a difference, the timing, certainly. It allowed these little mammalian little things, we don't quite know which ones they were, to flourish, allowed mammals to then flourish on the Earth. So the timing clearly changed. Did it, again, coming back to Simon, did it change then the ultimate, what happened in the end, the timing of it, but not what happened, he would want to say. Eventually, we would emerge, different timing maybe, and so forth. So, but that's also true of many, many other extinction events. There have been some big extinction events of most of the species on this Earth have been wiped out, and then you get this renewal and expansion. So it's a fascinating history, actually. A drama, a theodrama, I like to call it. Thank you.
Denis, just one final question. For our brother who earlier expressed doubts about sufficient evidence to back up the argument for evolution, is there a book of yours or another book that you would recommend is worth reading?
Yeah, there is so Creation and Evolution, do we have to choose? Book on the bookstall there. It sort of incorporates some of the evidence. It doesn't set out all the evidence, but there's quite a bit of evidence in there. But there's a very good book by, I'm trying to remember his name, and I know him, American guy who lives in California, and I'm blanking on his, by the time we discuss later, his name will pop back in my head, who's written a couple of very good books, which actually sets out the evidence, So there are some good books around. I'm sorry I don't remember his name, but I can find it for you. Yeah. Sorry, if that's not as satisfactory.
During the book signing?
Yeah, by the time I get up there, probably his name will come back in my head.
Okay, wonderful.
Bit of jet lag there. Blame the jet lag.
That's okay.
Yeah.
One of the things that we have come to so appreciate here at Regent College is in our public lectures, we just have the best, most thoughtful and insightful questions. Such are the type of people that we draw here to Regent. And again, tonight, you, our audience, and those online have demonstrated that. So thank you for your thoughtful questions. And one of the other things that we cherish deeply at Regent is that we're a community that can hold different beliefs around some of these things, but come together to say, this is God's magnificent creation. The Bible gives us the who and the why, not necessarily the how and the when. as a number of our Old Testament professors have taught us about the book of Genesis. So, Denis, thank you for a marvelous lecture, very thought-provoking lecture, and for handling the questions so adroitly. We're truly grateful. We appreciate the way you have stewarded the gifts that God has given you and your education to observe this beautiful creation and then to be a service to the church. So would you join me in thanking Dr. Denis Alexander for tonight's lecture? You can, at this point, if you want to make your way to the bookstore, I just have a couple of closing announcements that I will make. Denis, as you go by the back, there's a donation box. I'm not asking you for a donation. I'm really just highlighting it for our guests here tonight. If you've enjoyed tonight's lecture and have appreciated this ministry of Regent College of providing free evening public lectures every spring and summer, feel free to drop some money in that box. Or you can go online to rgnt, all the consonants in Regent, .edu/give. That will allow you to make an online donation. I would be remiss if I didn't thank our many donors around the world who make it possible for us to have this ministry. Thank you to all of you who attended in person and those who are watching online or those who will watch in the future on our YouTube channel. It's important to note this lecture will be available on our YouTube channel probably within 24, 48 hours, and will be available through the entire summer. So if you appreciated this lecture or want to have a discussion with friends, you can just search Regent College YouTube. It'll take you right to our channel, find the lecture, and forward it on to friends. If you are around here in Vancouver on Wednesday at 12 noon, Dr. Alexander and our very own Dr. Ross Hastings will be doing a lunchtime conversation on the matter of theology and science. And Dr. Hastings, who teaches theology, also has a scientific PhD. So that should be a very fascinating lunchtime conversation, 12 to 12:45 here in, I probably believe it'll be room 100, which is where we normally have those. So please come back and join us on Wednesday at 12 noon. And then 1 week from Wednesday, June 4th, is our next evening public lecture. And that features Dr. Aubrey Buster, who will be lecturing on Daniel 12 and the hope of glory. So feel free to join us. There's other announcements coming up about what's happening through the summer. And as Pablo said at the beginning, sign up to receive our news and updates so you're aware of everything that's going on at Regent. But thank you for being here. It's been a delight to host you. Hope we see you again this week and next and throughout the summer. God bless you. Have a good night.